Next time Jack came over, I asked him again to clarify my position as a watcher, and I wanted to know how I could get started. "Why are you asking me, Jeff?" he asked, hesitated, and continued. "That is up to you. Are you fit to take on the responsibility of a watcher? Do you desire to fulfill that role?" I said with a measure of uneasiness, "I don't know until I try, I guess." I had a sense of what it requires, and besides it was my idea in the first place, right? Jack put his hands up, then said, "Okay, have at it. Please don't create work for me." I smiled while Jack laughed at me. I understood a watcher traveled around observing people, places and things, and I could manage that. I have been doing that since I got here. So, the next day I took Louis sightseeing. I already knew a lot, but I wished to explore places I had not traveled to yet, and I was ready to go anywhere. Perhaps I could find a small town or a city to settle in and observe for a while. I didn't want to take Jack from his obligations as he informed me not to, so I asked Bart to accompany me. First thing, I asked Bart if we should go to Earth. He warned me that Jack told me I could not go to the Earth because I might see something I shouldn't, such as the Temple of God. I knew I couldn't go to the temple, I didn't realize I couldn't go to the Earth either. Bart reminded me it might produce complications when I returned to my world. Then, I asked him if he had any suggestions where we should go first. He said Edmonton, which was one of the first American cities inhabited by the families, and on the planet Academy. It was a marvelous idea, and it would be our first stop. We came to rest over a park that ran down the center of a neighborhood, a block wide and 50 or 60 blocks long, where another park began. I guess the park changed names every 60 blocks even though it stretched for miles. Also, there was another similar park every other block running east and west. Houses lined both sides of the park, 1950-style homes with big covered porches and front yards. Kids and companions were playing up and down the street. Families were having picnics in the park, and others were in their front yards watering or working in the gardens. The time frame seemed different. I asked Bart, "Is this a different time?" He replied, "No. It is because of the scenery. Most families moved out into the rest of Sierra, but some generations stayed as many who grew up in these neighborhoods continued to live here. Edmonton was a charming place as was any place in Sierra. It all started here on Academy for many. While still living on Earth, all the American families voted on what era neighborhoods would exist here in Edmonton. The American families, overwhelmingly, chose 1950s-style neighborhoods. I recall having a great deal of influence in that consensus. Even though the starting time frame was consistent throughout Academy, different cultures established various kinds of neighborhoods based on their culture. Again, Edmonton matched 1950s America. Bart suggested we go for a walk. It was heartwarming to observe the houses with families living in them. Trees lined the outside the park on both sides, shading the whole street. Well, it was not a street, but more like a wide cobblestone walkway, no cars allowed. Sidewalks lined both sides of the walkway. As it turns out, the center walkway was designed for the transportation vehicles to land, as two of them landed while we walked. Several of the yards had stone or brick walls. I always like yards with high stone walls. We stopped to talk with a young man out mowing his front lawn. A young Malamute puppy was lying up against the stones next to the sidewalk, absorbing the cool stones shaded by the trees. I bent down to pet the pup. I then noticed the young man was mowing with an old push mower. When I was a youngster, I had a lawn mowing route. I used a push mower like the one he was using. "I love old push mowers," I said to the young man. What I remember most was the shooish sound the blades made, metal against metal, as you pushed and then pulled them back. Push mowers were all I had back in my day. I did not like the power mowers at first, and would tell my customers they would nick up your yard. Although, I have grown to love their sound, particularly early spring, as it meant a neighbor was mowing their lawn, which I liked. It seemed such a natural thing to do. Now, I embrace the sound of both. We talked a while as I petted the puppy. Then, an invitation came from the park across the street. "Hey John, Lunch is ready. Bring your friends with you. Evidently, a few of the neighbors were enjoying a barbecue. I strolled over with John to a long picnic table arrayed with all kinds of food, fried chicken, potato salad and many kinds of homemade goodies. As I took my seat, I heard a small voice. "Hey mister, want some fish?" I caught it myself. The child asked. I glanced down to a young blonde-haired boy standing there, peering up at me with a wide grin, carrying a plate of grilled trout in his hands. "Yes, I would like some," I replied. I had an excellent time. We talked and laughed for a couple hours. What a nice neighborhood. When done with lunch, we said goodbye. Bart and I wandered for another hour. It would have been nice to experience more of Edmonton, but Bart suggested we go to another neighborhood. I asked, why? "You'll find out," he replied. It surprised me when we passed over then landed in the Chinese city of Hubei next to an enormous palace with a massive square. We sat down next to a set of huge wooden gates and an immense stone wall circling the whole palace. Once through the gates, I caught the smoke and aroma of food from hundreds of street peddlers. A group passed us carrying jianbing, a Chinese street food comparable to a grape. It virtually made me wish I hadn't just eaten. The square was gigantic, with thousands of people meandering around. A street or path stretched in both directions from just inside the gate. It was as wide as a highway. Once we crossed it, we walked down 15 steps to the main square. Directly across from the gate was the Grand Palace. It took up 1/3 of the compound. The people climbing its stairs looked like insects. Personally, I was not as enamored with the palace as I was the other buildings lining the square. Restaurants and shops were painted red, green, and brown, with paper lanterns swinging from one end to the other, looking as if they came right out of an ancient dynasty. Every vendor wore a straw hat, each one crying out for customers to come buy their wares. I went looking for a straw hat. Every 25 yards was an oriental garden, with fountains, and benches for relaxing. A few individuals were raking sand pits placed throughout each garden, but most sat on the benches talking and eating their Chinese fast food. I suspected a majority of the people to be sightseers, many of whom carried bags while passing from shop to shop. We entered a shop, and I got a pouch of rice candy, and then continued wandering around for a couple more hours, within the square. After agreeing with Bart to take a tour of the rest of Hubei, we exited through the gates and called for Louis. The rest of downtown Hubei, being 4 times the size of the square, looked to be ancient due to its architecture, but I detected nothing archaic about the people. Once in the suburbs, it looked like I was in a different version of the country. Houses lined the streets, with yards, sidewalks, and parks. It seemed average. I, being an American by culture, watched for similar areas I was used to. I discovered nothing unique in the burbs. Every culture existed in Sierra, and we did not draw boundary lines on stature, but culture, and anyone could live in any culture desired. Some adventurous citizens elected to live in a different culture than the one they were raised in. The rest, because it was natural, preferred to live as they remembered their own homes, their own countries, which made practical sense. We left Hubei and sailed over most of the rest of the continent. I saw hundreds of attractive Chinese cities as we passed. I suspected the Asian population was the largest community in Sierra. Bart told me the Asian people comprised over 20% of the overall population of Sierra. Bart said, the adult population in many Asian countries back on Earth were almost wiped out by the Great War, and most of the orphan children left were of Asian lineage. It only seemed natural. I agreed. Next, Bart took me over to the European continent on academy, called Calabria. We stopped in a modest village called Vinello, close to the base of the Alto mountain range. Vinello was a gorgeous town with all the markings of a European village, with its cobblestone streets and masonry buildings. Every balcony window displayed hanging gardens. The town was flanked on 3 sides by rolling hills laced with vineyards, and the municipality itself was quite hilly. To the one side, to the north of the city, was the high Alto mountain range. The Alto Mountains reached practically straight up 15,000 feet into the sky. The range was white-capped and frequently disappeared into the clouds, as if the sky stretched a cap over them. Often, when the wind came out of the north, you felt the cool breeze carrying the wonderful smell of fresh snow. Bart pointed out a little bistro. So, we sat to have a cup of coffee. I drank coffee while Bart educated me on the country of Calabria. While sitting, we struck up a conversation with the group of mountain climbers, many of whom stayed in the small bed and breakfasts there. Since the Alto Mountains had the highest peaks on Academy, many climbers had to scale them. When I asked the young men why they climbed, and if it wasn't too much work, "Because it's there," was the answer I got from each of them. I replied, "Well, I have heard the term before." We laughed together. Then I said it was a sport for mortal men because an immortal could be at the top in a blink of an eye, or one might take a transport, cancelling the troublesome work. After a brief pause, their leader responded, "Yeah, I guess there are advantages to being mortal." Then he chuckled. I smiled and concurred with him. They had to leave. So, we said, "Goodbye, see you again." I hollered, "Have a great climb," to them before they disappeared around the corner. I would have said break a leg, but I wasn't sure how that would have gone over. It might have been the wrong term for the situation. Bart continued filling me in on the area and how climbing is pertinent to the livelihood of Vinello. I ordered warm bread with garlic and olive oil. What a contrast of people one could discover at any moment. Academy was the only planet in Sierra which had all the diverse cultures on its surface because the first settlements were there. Again, many remained and continued living there after the rest moved into different areas of Sierra. It would stay the only multicolored marble in Sierra. As I sat there listening to Bart, I knew everything he said was both fresh and familiar in my mind. As soon as he mentioned a place, a person, or a thing, it was like he told me something I already knew. I continued suffering to readjust my mind as I kept asking myself, how can I recognize these things? After a while, we left town. I told Bart that I would like to fly over the mountains when leaving. They reminded me of the Alps in their height and sharpness. I thought it would be interesting. Once above them, the mountain tops were so white it hurt my eyes to look at them. We closed in on one mountain where we saw several black dots on top. It turned out to be a dozen climbers who had just reached its peak. They waved at us as we passed overhead. When we reached the other side, I noticed a purple dot right below the snow line. So, I told Louis to head for the spot. When we got there, we found an alpine meadow. The meadow was steep as it sloped from one end to the other and appeared to be quite a climb from bottom to top. In the center was a single tree. Just before the snow, at the top of the meadow, was a large field of small lavender flowers. Several black and white cows were grazing among them. I'm sure they were Jerseys. 2 sheepdogs were stretched out at the lower end of the field, apparently watching over the cows. At the bottom end of the meadow was a barn, I guess an average-size barn attached to a small cabin. Along the left side as we faced the lavender field was a fast-flowing creek that began where the snow ended and continued down the mountain. I assumed it was snow runoff. It was light blue, almost white. I imagined it was freezing. We came to rest in the middle of the field next to the tree. After exiting Louis, I noticed it to be a single pear tree full of ripe pears. I picked one and took a bite. It was cold, refreshing, and out of place. As we were standing there looking for the next best pear to pick, a large blonde-haired man came walking up from behind us and said, "Hi. I don't get many visitors up here. Are you looking for me?" I turned round and replied, "No." We saw the purple flowers and stopped to look. Then, I noticed the pear tree and helped myself to one. "They're good, aren't they?" he responded. "They are." We stood there looking at each other for a minute. After we snapped out of our stupor, he said, "Sorry for not introducing myself, I'm not used to having people around when I am up here. My name is Philip T. People call me Phil, and yours?" "Hi Phil, my name is Jeff, Jeff Flake." We shook hands. "Okay, I know who you are. What brings you this way, Jeff Flake?" "Well, my companion, Bart and I are just traveling around Academy checking things out. It has been too long since I have been here, and I thought it was time to reacquaint myself. Well, welcome to my little space in heaven, Jeff. Thank you. This is a beautiful place. What do you do up here, Phil? I asked. He pointed at the cows and the flowers as he responded, I bring the cows up here every spring. They gorge on the lavender flowers that only grow in this little meadow, from middle of May to the end of July, and that is it. They grow nowhere else that I know of. As a profession, I make cheese and the flowers add a sweetness I can't get anywhere else. They also add a beautiful lavender tint to the cheese. Wow, what kind of cheese do you make? I asked. It is a kind of brie. I called it lavender brie. These flowers give me about 1,400 kilos every year of my special blend. Phil told us he lived in a small village called Furtherton, about 10 miles down at the base of the mountain. I jumped in, Furtherton? What kind of name is that? It kind of just grew on the settlers there. It seems everyone who ever lived there said it was further than they had ever been before, which referred to the remote situation of the village. I didn't know if I should laugh. It was hard to keep a straight face. Phil continued, once the flowers are gone, I take the cows back down to my farm just outside the small village of. He paused, then looked at me and said Furtherton, as he broke out laughing. I joined him for a moment, but not too much because I didn't want to overstay my welcome. He told me he has been doing so for 163 years, which I thought was amazing. So, the flowers grow nowhere else? I asked. Jeff, I figured that all over heaven there are little pockets of miracles. This little patch of flowers is one of those miracles for me. Then he told me his story. I was a corrupt politician back in Chicago in the 1950s and associated with just about every mobster alive at the time. I chased women, drank until, and after, the bars closed. The cops knew me and were afraid of me. I never got pulled over no matter how drunk I was. That would have been a death sentence for them. That was the horrible influence I had. I was middle management for bribes and extortion of other politicians. One day a rival mob boss put a hit out on another. Instead of killing the other boss, his crew shot up a car full of a young family. I confronted him and he didn't seem to care. When I saw the picture of that beautiful family, who was taken from the earth because of someone's sick hatred, I decided that I could not live like that any longer. The faces of those young children were more than I could bear. I attended the funeral of that young family. I was heartbroken by what had happened to them. While at the funeral, the sister of the young man stood up and explained how the family had lived their short lives for Christ. She cried with a brokenness that tore me apart, but all the while expressing her faith and the faith of her brother and his family. I could not resist what she was saying. I thought to myself, how in a world such as this can life be safe for such as this young couple and their children? How can it disappear in such an instant? There must be a better way, a better place. I cried out inside, knowing I needed God, knowing He has to have something better than this world offered. I sensed that in the words of the young man's sister. It was like it was me she was speaking to. I felt a great deal of turmoil for myself and that young family. I now understood that He was the only way I could turn my life, this life around. Before that moment, I was rich and a popular politician. I craved the nightlife and rubbed noses with the elite of the city, and used to being around wealth and the finer things in life, but I became empty, lost, and desperate. One day, I confronted the boss again who put out the hit and told him I wanted no more to do with that life, and wanted to turn over a new leaf. I told him I was going to look into what God had for me, and that is what I did. Then, I asked, did the mob boss just let you go? Oh. No, he didn't. Larry had me murdered 2 days later, and here I am, he said chuckling. That guy had ice water in his veins, he said. Now, this is my life. This meadow is my miracle, he proclaimed. You know what is funny? I and my best friend here in heaven visit that family every November for what we call Thanksgiving. I guess it is still a holiday with most of the Americans. It is my favorite time of the year being with them. I thought about my time with my family at Thanksgiving and now longed to be there again. He went on, I can't think of a more rewarding life than the one I am living now. I didn't respond as I was deep in thought. After a short pause, he asked, aren't you going to ask me who my best friend is? No, should I? Is it someone I know? I responded. I don't think so, but you might find it interesting. Okay, who is your best friend here in Sierra, Phil? He began to laugh, and laughed so hard and loud, I am sure it echoed all the way down the mountain. He was laughing and praising God until he almost cried, and then said, his name is Larry. I didn't catch it at first. I had to think about it for a second, then began to laugh myself at the irony. We both laughed and praised God for a long time. How in the world can this be? Then he told me, Larry wondered how I could give up such a great life for God of all things. So, he looked into it, out of curiosity. The deeper he looked, the more God convicted him. One day a light went off and he realized who God was. He hated what he found at first, but eventually, he repented and turned his life over to Christ, and he turned himself into the police assuming he needed to make reconciliation for his many criminal acts. He spent 3 years in prison, during which, he started a prison ministry. He should have spent the rest of his life in prison, but I guess God had different plans for him. After he got out, he continued his prison ministry, and spent the next 3 years on the street preaching about his conversion. The one boss he tried to have murdered heard him one day and made fun of him. Then a miracle, right there on that street, Larry led him to the Lord. He led many bad people to Christ. The remaining mob bosses had him and the other mob boss, Elliot, murdered because they were converting all of their associates. Many of them after being converted came forward to law enforcement. Larry had become the most dangerous man in all of Chicago. He stopped laughing, looked at me and said, I could not be more grateful for what God has done in my life, and that one man whom he had given the honor of mentioning Christ. I agreed, God can do so much with the right clay. That evening Phil and the dogs rounded up the cows and put them in the barn. Then, Phil and I talked into the night. We built a campfire and sat under the pear tree, under a big full moon which lit up all the snow-capped mountains around us. Other than the warmth of the fire, it was chilly otherwise. The night in the mountains was a breathtaking experience. Bart and I spent the night in Louis parked in the field next to that pear tree. I slept on the couch in the main cabin which gave me a panoramic view of the mountains. I assumed Bart plugged into the hive for the night. Hopefully, he didn't tell everybody about the hot coal I sat on, causing me to jump around holding my bum for just a little over a minute. Nah, he wouldn't. Early next morning, I stepped outside and took a seat on a rock protruding up from the ground. The surrounding mountains were magnificent. The early sun painted them orange and pink, with a bright blue background. Phil came up, gave me a cup of coffee and offered me some of his famous cheese. It was just as he said, wonderful. After sitting there for a while peering over the mountains, a picture lit up in my head. I caught something out of the corner of my eye while walking in Edmonton and now I realized what it was. I said goodbye to Phil, and told Bart, let's go back to Edmonton. Once back in Edmonton, we approached an intersection, and I saw what it was. No, I said as I stared. Here it is, Bart. What? He responded with a perplexed smile. Unbelievable, it was a grocery store fashioned after one I lived by as a kid back on Earth. We called it the White House Grocery and a man named Mr. McNamara owned it. My brothers and I would go there daily to buy candy and the 1880 ice cream bars. It started as a 2-story home. Mr. McNamara transformed it into a small market. It was a 2-story White House with a screen door at the corner. I walked up and opened the screen door. It creaked just as I recalled. As I entered, I saw the dark hardwood floors, and the beams supporting the 2nd story where the McNamaras once lived. There were the coolers and shelves along the walls, just as I remembered. By the front door were 2 bay windows, one on either side of the door that was cut right into the corner of the building, with a small cement porch out front. A companion, or a person who resembled Mr. McNamara, tall, heavy-set, silver hair, and wearing a white shirt, stood at the counter in the middle of the room. Maybe it was Mr. McNamara himself. The images came surging back. I couldn't tell how many times I heard the melody from the Twilight Zone. I walked up to him, said hi, and asked if he was the real McNamara, and if he was, did he recognize me? Then, I explained what had happened and my present state. He said, I have wondered where you have been. You have been coming in at least once a week for years. It has been a few months since you have done so. I assumed you must be busy elsewhere. So, yes, I am the real McNamara, and you are one of those kids who came into my store almost daily. You had 2 sisters and 2 brothers who often came in with you, oh, and the Russell kids, and Stephen Tyndall with his sisters. I remember all of you. I smiled with an extraordinary smile, and then replied, I will have a Dad's root beer and some licorice, please. He smiled at me and pointed me to the sodas and the candy. You didn't expect me to come out there and get them for you, did you? He said as he laughed. Imagine how fantastic. He had Dad's root beer. The store was still on mission, providing for the kids in the neighborhood, selling junk food, candy, and soda, staples for energetic and growing neighborhood kids. As I thanked him, I saw 2 people walk across the back of the store. The couple said hello to Mr. McNamara while crossing. I followed them as they exited McNamara's through one of 2 double-wide doorways in the back corner to the right, situated across from another door leading out the back of the store. You couldn't see them from the front of the store. I suspected that the main entrance was in the back. I didn't remember this about the market. As I was heading to the back of the store, a group of kids came running through. Mr. McNamara yelled at them to slow down. They completely ignored him. I followed them and passed through one of the double-wide doors which opened onto a ramp leading into an underground supermarket. The supermarket looked so natural as fake sunlit skylights were strategically placed up and down the rows of groceries. I noticed transparent force fields around the food products, produce and dairy. With exception of a slight distortion, the products were visible, yet in stasis. Nothing aged at the natural rate. For example, if you put an apple within the field, it remained fresh for months and other items lasted for years. Nothing goes to waste in Sierra. These stores had only existed in my imagination, but now I was excited to see one in person. I estimated I have been here for 6 to 7 months. The whole time, I have never had a reason to run to the store. Bart and Dana took care of most of my needs. Am I lazy or what? I didn't remember them specifically. Once I was on the ramp, I remembered dreaming of them in my daydreams. I recalled thousands of these stores were throughout Sierra and placed in every neighborhood. Everything within the store was free to everyone. Every store was equipped with a companion group to manage inventory and order needed items. Specials restocked and maintained the store. I thought it would be a good time to shop. I started by picking out fruit and sodas as I worked on filling up a small pushcart with junk food, expecting to be out for at least 3 or 4 days. As I was picking through the apples, that group of young kids came flying up, pushing me out of the way, each filling their knapsacks with apples. I chuckled and then inquired what was the hurry and why so many apples. One stared at me and said, "We plan to fly kites on the floating mountains today." He pointed to a kite strapped to his back. He said the apples were for the horses in the fields below. "Hey, do you mind if I tag along?" I asked. The boys agreed it was okay. I grabbed a few more apples and headed out the exit with them and called for Louie. We got in and headed off to the floating mountains. In the control room of Louie, the couch came up out of the floor and the kids sat down. The trip wasn't long enough for them to enter goofing off mode. Once on the floating mountains, I watched them fly their kites. Then, we explored 2 of the medieval castles erected on top, which appeared as if to come out of the 1500s. It was exciting investigating them. Sierra was a consummate mix of the old and the new. The boys made swords out of tree branches lying on the ground. As soon as I picked one up, they assailed me, chasing me all over the place. I discarded mine, ran and jumped into a fountain, clothes and all. There were fountains deep enough to swim in up top. Back in one area of this mountain was a hill where the center had caved in. It brimmed with rainwater to create a small lake. The small lake produced a creek which dripped over the side. It was amusing to see the creek fall halfway down the mountain, then take a 90-degree turn and spill out past the gravity shelf before it plunged to the ground. Each of the floating mountains looked like a giant ice cream cone, with a circumference on top ranging from 5 to 10 miles. The bottom of each was just a few meters in circumference. The mountains were transported here then placed on several lakes and beach fronts throughout Sierra. These massive stone structures had strong opposing magnetic forces of the ground below them, which held them 30 to 50 feet above the surface at each location. The land mass at the top was covered by natural soil so trees, plants, and grasses would grow. If someone chose to, they could enter from the bottom, as a center passageway was bored into the middle of the structure. Stairs, looking like a spiral stairwell, were put in so you could climb them. It was an eerie climb and always cool, damp, and dark. You had to hold on to the railing once you got towards the middle as you would float. You had to pull yourself a short distance, then your feet would drop back onto the stairs. After someone climbed the stairs, their hair would stand up for 15 minutes to an hour. When the kids became tired of exploring, flying their kites, and beating on one another, we all lay down, leaned over the edge, and tossed apples out onto the beach below. It wasn't too long before a small herd of wild horses came out of the forest and devoured them. What a remarkable sight to see such magnificent horses. We had to toss the apples out and away from the cliffs to get them to fall to the ground. Otherwise, they got trapped on the gravity shelf halfway down the mountain. The gravity shelf resulted from magnetic fields generated by the downward pull of the ground and the upward push of the mountain itself. Those forces met somewhere near the middle of the mass, making for an almost solid sheet of gravity. The shelf proved flexible enough you could jump from the top and the shelf would catch you without harm in the middle. As one fell closer to the center, they'd slow down and would almost be set gently on the shelf. That would happen at the same place you would float when taking the stairs. Afterward, a transport would have to come get you. After a while, I was on my way. I asked them if they needed a ride. The oldest kid replied, "Nah. We would like to stay a while longer." I bid them farewell and called for Louis. When leaving, Bart mentioned the educational facilities on Academy. Bart planned to say something about it while we were in Edmonton, but got distracted. I already had an idea what the facilities looked like, but we decided we would go visit. The educational facilities lay 50 miles south of Edmonton and were enclosed by an enormous dome. The dome was 200 miles in circumference. As we approached, we saw it glistening in the sunlight from miles away. How impressive how such a structure could be built. Since the end of the Great War, architecture had made significant advancements. Now, any kind of building or structure could be constructed. Architecture was not restricted by anything other than one's imagination. The Terwillegy complex along with the other comparable facilities sat right on the edge of someone's imagination. In the beginning, Terwillegy was the only educational facility in Sierra, and remained so for the first 10 years. It took almost a full decade for the citizens to acclimate to life in Sierra. There is now 136 such facilities, one built on each planet. Every facility contained several elementary, middle, and high schools. Also, each dome housed a community college, and a major university. Major universities were built in the center of each dome. Elementary, middle and high schools were placed on the outskirts of the dome, within 1 mile of each other, with the elementary schools placed closest to the outer walls of the dome, then the middle and the high school, respectively. Community colleges were established adjacent to, but outside each of the major universities. The interior of every dome contained an artificial atmosphere set at a steady 76 degrees, and at constant noon. If you were inside the dome, it was always noon, lunchtime. Although children attended classes all hours of the day, their attendance depending on the time zone they actually lived in, and whether they lived within the educational boundaries of each facility. For that reason, the interior time of each dome was set so students would not have to deal with the different hours of the day within a particular facility. It allowed for children to attend school during normal daylight hours, 24 hours per day. At the year 206, there were only 65 million people living in Sierra, 32 million were children attending grade through high school. 10 of the educational facilities would handle 32 million children, so many of the kindergarten through high school buildings sat vacant. Transportation vehicles or school buses picked children up at 8 a.m. Each bus transported 200 students. Designated areas were designed in each neighborhood for bus zones. Then the students would be delivered to assigned spots outside the dome. The parking area surrounding the dome was more than ample to park all the transportation vehicles and more. We landed in a parking lot at least 200 feet wide and circled the entire dome. In between the parking lot and the dome was a spacious section of grass. Brick walkways led from the parking lot 20 feet into the grass, ending at small stone structures with automatic doors. 2,500 of those small buildings surrounded the dome. Each one was an entrance to the subway system. The underground system was carefully marked and simple to follow. Should a student get disoriented, their companion always knew where to go. Also, along the walls inside the subway system displayed well-lit pertinent entrance and exit information, along with lighted maps of the area immediately above that location. Inside the dome was a corresponding small building with matching numbers to the exterior entrance, numbered from 1 to 2,500. School buses parked in assigned areas to unload students, who would use the exterior entrances and connecting subways to locate their school. When a child started the school year, they were presented a route starting with a building number in which they would enter the dome. That would be the starting place for each student. They would progress along an established route once inside the subway system. The subway system included bullet trains for the high school and college students, or anyone who had to travel further into the dome for whatever reason. We entered Building 1906, which led to the center of the campus of Kamikaze University, one of the 106 major universities throughout Sierra. Once inside, you could not tell without an intensive investigation whether the environment was real. Also, the sunlight provided by the structure was favorable for plants and trees. As we came out into the dome, we observed several yard crews in the process of maintaining the grounds. It looked like a modern metropolitan city once inside. The builders used a variety of advanced architectural designs, if there was such a thing anymore. Many of the buildings in the center of the campus reached as high as 10 stories with skywalks between them. The towering buildings housed research libraries and offices for the professors. Others housed the dorms for those students who lived on campus. Many did, as it gave them the opportunity to live on their own. I guess it was important to college students even in a society such as this. The ground levels or first floors of the high-rises looked more like museums than office complexes or apartments. Vast displays of contemporary art occupied the lobbies. I recognized one of John's sculptures up against a wall in the one high-rise we entered. I'm sure I could live there. Also, the buildings offered access elevators to the subways below. I found it hard to accept it was a college campus. Too bad campuses weren't like this when I attended college. It was impressive. The grounds looked like manicured gardens. Squares with fountains, the ones where the water shot up from the ground into the air, were common. Tree-lined pathways led from one public space to another, which made for wonderful areas to relax while studying or whatever one might do under the shade of a comfortable tree. Hundreds of students sat around talking and studying while others rushed from class to class, all of them crowding the squares and small restaurants along the way. Trolleys came and disappeared from every direction. I can only imagine how exciting it would be to be a first-year student at the university. Bart and I took a trolley to the burbs. The burbs are what the university students called the community college outside the university campus. The community college campus was called Fairweather CC. All the buildings were old-fashioned brick and mortar, with interiors of natural woodwork and tile. Most exteriors were overgrown with ivy up to the roof. I guess you could call them Ivy League colleges. I genuinely liked the traditional buildings. The campus was not nearly as lively as the universities, although it was a remarkably peaceful environment. Although fair weather could provide as valuable an education as any major university, it mostly catered to adult community education, university prep for high school students, and anyone returning to school after years away. The community campuses were built with the future in mind, knowing enrollment would eventually reach capacity. We took the trolley back to Building 1906 and departed. Once back outside the dome, I recognized many of the small buildings on the outside to be freight entrances for restaurants, cafeterias, shops, and maintenance. It boggled my imagination how each facility was such a tremendous undertaking. It required thousands of teachers, support staff, and products for each level of education. We entered again at Building 30. The path led to an elementary school, kindergarten through 6th grade. The interior exit building came out to what looked like spring in an English countryside. All the trees were full of heavy white and pink blossoms. I could smell dogwood, which is one of my favorite smells of all time. There was a long walkway leading up the front of the school. A white fence surrounded the school grounds. I assumed the kids were out for recess as the playground was overwhelmed with children. A teacher approached us and asked, "Can I help you?" I replied, "No, we're okay." I explained who we were and then I said, "It has been a while since I have been to Terwillegar, and we will only be here for a short period." She responded, "Should you need anything please ask." "Will do," I said. We walked around for an hour until I got hungry from smelling the cooking coming from the cafeteria. We came across a first grader loudly debating with a teacher, which was interesting. I knew adults should never get into a debate with an angel. The angel will be the kindest opponent, but they will use words which a mortal cannot understand and prove their point to everyone but you. Everyone in the area will stare at you trying to understand why you don't get it. So, should you sense you might get into an argument with an angel, politely excuse yourself and go get a candy bar, or go outside and sit by a pool of water until you can calm down. Be smart, don't come back for at least 15 minutes. There is an exception to the rule. The exception is if one is a kindergartner through 4th grader. No one, not even an angel, can comprehend their logic. Even an angel could spend hours trying to figure that conversation out. If an argument should ensue between anyone in that age group and an angel, the angel will always turn and walk away, and if necessary, they will call the parents. I overheard the teacher telling the student to head to the cafeteria before they missed lunch, then she quickly walked away. We walked through the grounds and buildings. We came across a group of 5th graders discussing basic physics. I knew this because the one with the smirk asked me a question. "Do you understand what effect intelligence has on the second law of thermodynamics, and how to measure it?" I turned to Bart and said, "I've had enough." We left. Bart asked me, "Would you like to see one of the newer facilities?" I replied, "No. I am sure when you've seen one, you've seen them all." 5th graders, indeed. It was nice to see Terwillegar, the first campus, and like everything else since coming to Sierra, it felt like a constant déjà vu. Terwillegar made me realize I was missing so much. 200 years of progress and I can still only imagine what it was like when it was first constructed. Only imagine what it was like when it was first constructed. Only imagine what it was like when it was first constructed. Only imagine what it was like when it was first constructed. Only imagine what it was like when it was first constructed. Only imagine